So last week we were talking about the clock of eons, and we said that this is a way to show the history of the earth, right? And most of the time on the clock of eons was time when there was no life or just tiny, like microscopic life, right? So this Hadean eon and the Archean eon, the Proterozoic eon, these were all times when there was either no life or just little microscopic life. And then we get to this final eon, the Phanerozoic eon. And so much was happening during this eon that we break it up even further into eras. This is the time when most life began, more than just those tiny little microscopic one cell life forms. So, this is the eon that we're going to be focusing on today. We're going to be focusing on looking at life on Earth and when real life really started on Earth. So, when we look at the Phanerozoic eon, we can see that it's broken up into even smaller pieces, and these are called eras. So an era is just like a time frame. It's like a period of time that has like distinct characteristics or things that are alike about it. So the first era is called the Paleozoic era, and that's the one that we're going to look at today. So we're going to look at the Paleozoic era because that's when life really started on the earth. And we can look at our clock of eons to really look at the history of Earth. But when we start to look at the life on Earth, there's actually a better way for us to look at it. So we're going to look at a timeline of life. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see it. So when we start looking at the timeline of life on Earth, this is a little bit better way for us to look at it than the clock of eons. So we can see that our first era is the Paleozoic era, and there are more eras during this Phanerozoic eon. But today we're going to just focus on the Paleozoic era because so much happened during this time. And so much happened during the Paleozoic era that we break it up even further into periods. So we have the Cambrian period, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, and Permian. And those are all just different periods during the Paleozoic era. They break it up even further because so much was happening during this time. So we're talking about 500 million years ago here, guys. This is about 542 million years ago to 251 million years ago about that this is all happening. Paleozoic means ancient life. So that's where this name Paleozoic comes from. It actually means ancient life. And this was a time when all major plants and animals appeared on the earth. So this was a huge important time in the history of our planet because this was the time when all major groups of animals and plants appeared. At the beginning, there was just this like microscopic life, right? That we talked about from the eon before. So we have just this microscopic life at the beginning. And then there was this explosion of life in the ocean. We went from seaweed and microscopic living things to things like jellyfish and worms and trilobites. So trilobites are one of these first arthropods, which meant that they had legs. They were invertebrates, but they had legs. They lived on the bottom of the sea. And I'm going to show you a couple of pictures. This is a different version of the timeline of life. I kind of like this because we can kind of see it a little bit clearer. So you can see the beginning of the trilobites here. We have our first seaweed happening over here. Animals started to have hard shells. Those arthropods started showing up, which had legs. And we have lots of cool fossils of trilobites. So you can kind of really see what they looked like. They had a bunch of legs. They got really big. They lived on the bottom of the ocean. And oops. And there we go. Let's get that down a little bit so you can see it. Here we go. And they lived and they thrived during this. This was called the Age of Invertebrates. And then all of a sudden they just died out and we don't know why. But during this time, there was so much happening all at the same time. So the trilobites were around and they were thriving. Sea scorpions were another type of arthropod that was living on in the ocean. And there's lots of cool fossils of the sea scorpions. Cockroaches were more arthropods that were living during this time. So there were lots of these invertebrates at the time that were all living in the water. And then we had insects beginning. And let me share the other timeline here. There we go. So we can see insects starting to form, and insects started first moving onto the land, right? In the ocean, we also had something called these echinoderms, and echinoderms were like these spiky little, they had a spiky skin. There were these starfish. There were sea urchins. Um, oh, that's the sea scorpion. So we had echinoderms. There were sea urchins. There were these crinoids that were like sea lilies, but they looked like trees, but they were actually animals that helped to clean the water. So all of these things were living during that time. And then we started seeing a big explosion of fish. So we have our crinoids, our sea lilies, that's all. Our trilobites are still around. And then we start seeing lots of fish, fish with a backbone. Fish evolved and changed a ton during this time. So you can see all the different types of fish that are forming. They changed a lot. And then slowly, fish began to, like some of the land started drying up. So fish began to crawl up on the land with their fins. They learned to breathe air and water. And their fins actually eventually became legs, and they became amphibians. So this kind of part of the Paleozoic era was called the Age of Amphibians. And one of the first amphibians that we start to see are these Ichthyostega. And that was one of the first amphibians that came from a fish crawling up onto the land and growing legs. You can see some different fossils of that Ichthyostega amphibian. At the end of the Carboniferous period, let's look at our timeline again. So here we're all the way over here. Our fish are evolving. We're seeing amphibians getting up onto the land, insects and worms. All of this is happening at the same time. And then at the end of the Carboniferous period, amphibians began to start laying their eggs on land. And the eggs had this like tough skin. And then we started seeing our first reptiles towards the end of the Paleozoic era. During this time also, the earth was just in all connected in one huge continent called Pangaea. So that was also happening during this time. At the end of the Paleozoic era on Pangaea, these reptiles really dominated the land. And that brings us into the next era, which we'll look at next time, which is the Mesozoic era. So by the end of Paleozoic, we see lots of reptiles. Different groups of animals thrived and then became extinct or went completely away during this time. So it was a really interesting time for the animals. During this time, there were also lots of things happening with the plants. Plants grew from that blue-green algae we were seeing lots of ferns. Plants started growing out of the water. During the Carboniferous period, it was warm and damp, and it was almost like a rainforest. So there were lots of ferns. And as they died, their layers pressed together and formed coal. And at the end of the Paleozoic era, plants were beginning to make seeds, which was really a huge explosion for them to be able to grow better. So during this time, during this Paleozoic era, there were so many changes happening with the animals and with the plants. So today and this week, you guys are going to be researching and looking at the Paleozoic era and thinking about all of the different things, all of the different animals and all of the different changes with plants that happened during that time.